Several years ago, about 5 years ago, Emily and I met Ibra at the SROG annual conference, and we were so impressed. Big you up now. We were so impressed. We thought this young man is going to go far, and he certainly has. And he's come all the way to Brighton to talk about his research on digital literacy with a great title, looking at epistemologies of ignorance. So Ibrahim's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions, discussion, debate, etc. So very warm welcome, and welcome to Sarah from Iran, who is online at the moment, and welcome to all of you. Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Hi everybody, lovely to see you all, and thank you for inviting me. You live up to the great weather here. It's my first time in Brighton. I put on a waistcoat because it was quite cold in Belfast, which is where I came from this morning. And then when I got here, it's pretty hot. So yeah, a warm welcome indeed. And thank you for inviting me as well. And so the title of the paper is, just Google it, Digital Literacies and Epistemologies of Ignorance. Originally there was two presenters, Alison Mackenzie and myself. And Alison was the one who's supposed to talk about epistemologies of ignorance, being philosophically trained and all. But it's the second time she's something's come up, so I've been dropped in on that side of the paper, which is fine. Okay, I hope I can do justice to that side of the topic. So in today's paper, I'll outline some ideas that have emerged in a research that I've carried out in Northern Ireland on research which looks at the digital literacy practices of undergraduate students. The ideas, those are my analysis tweets there. And this graphic here, very quickly, is just taken from the Science Journal of last year, which about this time last year, which looked at the spread of fake and true news. So one of them is the fake news story, which spread very far and wide, and the other one that followed it was the same story, but the true version, which was a lot slower, but actually was viewed by more people in the end. So that's just one example of some of the things I'll be talking about. So the ideas that I'm going to talk about in this paper are summed up roughly in two papers that have just come out that Alison and I have written, and further research that further papers that we're writing on the research that we've done. So the focus of the research was higher education, and we looked at undergraduate students across a range of disciplines, across different university types, universities that are subject to different kinds of administrative constraints and missions and things like that. So we looked at a number of things in the research, including how students search for information, how they make sense of it, how they discern the quality of the voluminous amounts of information that they encounter online. And we used a number of methods, including ethnographic interviewing and videography of the writing process, because we were looking at assignment writing. But first, it's good to give an outline of the disciplinary foundations of the research. So the research is based on a social practice approach to literacy. This is a set of approaches which some call literacy studies. And much of my recent work takes this kind of approach when looking at writing. Literacy studies, as you might know, begins with understanding literacy as part of people's social lives. It looks at the values and assumptions and networks and cultural processes around acts of literacy, rather than looking at literacy as a cognitive achievement skill independent of social context. How it occurs in the lives of people and in communities, and the subjectivities that permeate any act of literacy. So one of the appealing things about literacy studies that got me into the field was how it examines knowledge production. And it's borne out in many writings and forms of research where people have looked at literacy practices of a particular community or a particular person, and then you can get to know how knowledge is produced in that community, how it is valued in that community, how it is bequeathed in that community through a study of literacy. So literacy can't be divorced from power and knowledge creation. So when looking at digital literacy through the same sort of framing, one is led to look at the mundane, everyday acts of digital literacy, rather than looking at it as from a technocentric perspective, looking at what people do, rather than what people are sort of told what digital literacy is. And there's the works of Brian Street, the late Brian Street, who was at Sussex, I believe, wasn't he? Yeah. Harvey Graff, Deborah Brandt, David Barton, Mary Hamilton, and others are my influences there. What I'd like to highlight here then is that if literacy and knowledge production go hand in hand, and the study of literacy can tell you how knowledge is produced and can be quite illuminating when looking at that, then I think that literacy, a study of literacy, can also tell you about epistemologies of ignorance and how forms of ignorance or the absence of certain knowledge is fostered and perpetuated by literacy policy, by literacy practice. If literacy and knowledge production go hand in hand, then the same can be said about the reverse. Perhaps this slide can make that point a bit better. I'll just let you read that for a second. So, in this slide, a literacy policy was designed to systematically deprive one group of people from the ability to read and write, and subsequently to know their world around them in a manner commensurate with their fellow human beings in order to suppress them. The point I'm making is that an examination of literacy can also allow us to examine forms of ignorance and how they are fostered, how forms of ignorance can be sustained and perpetuated in society. Deborah Brandt's work on the sponsors of literacy is useful here. She argues that certain actors and agencies sponsor and promote certain kinds of literacy and subsequently certain kinds of knowing. They will also, I will argue, by definition, sponsor and promote the cultivation of certain kinds of ignorance. It's inevitable that they do. And the sponsors of literacy, perhaps at what once upon a time were religious institutions, and to some extent they can still be the sponsors of literacy, educational bodies, governments, but they can also be technology companies as well, who control and delineate what digital literacy is. And there is. And there's a lot of ignorance. Ignorance abounds online. There's a lot of ignorance about how digital technologies work. There's a lot of ignorance about how we're led down certain paths of inquiry when we search for things online. There's a lot of ignorance about how much of our informational world is algorithmically mediated and what are the factors and processes that lead us down to when we search for things and seek knowledge and learn. There are huge sponsors of literacy, digital literacy, who hold the secrets to these processes, and there are huge social impacts emerging from this. If I had a penny for every article out there on fake news and post-truth, I'd be able to fund a whole research project on it. But an exploration of trust also becomes very important here, because all of us in different ways, have multiple allegiances. We trust different kinds of people, different kinds of experts, perhaps religious leaders. Perhaps we have attachments to ideological groups. Perhaps we abide by certain kinds of groupthink tendencies. And when we do that sometimes, and if we do that very uncomfortable thing of perhaps listing our allegiances and our influences, we might realize how vulnerable we actually are, because trust opens you up to vulnerability. That's why we feel so betrayed when trust is broken. And intrinsic to trust is truth. If trust is the basis of civilization, as many argue, then truth is the basis of trust, according to many. And so what needs to be done is an examination of who we trust and how we trust those actors or bodies or people. Whether we trust our news feed on Facebook because we've honed it by deleting people who we don't like, or Twitter feeds, or peer-reviewed journals, or certain academics, etc., or certain, newspaper editors because they align with our political allegiances. Trust is at the very core of our knowledge creation and our knowledge production. So what we have tried to do in this research is not look at the issue of fake news through looking at the fakeness of the news. But what we have tried to do is to examine, it's consistent with the literacy studies perspective, which, remember, looks at the everyday mundane practices of digital literacy in the lives of people. what we do is we've looked at how the everyday user of technology goes about according epistemic trust to different actors in their searches for information online. So instead of looking at fakeness and the fakeness of the news, we're looking at the individual and how the individual accords trust to different things in their daily life. There is a preoccupation with facts, and I've got nothing against that. Fact checking and things like that. That's all very important. But remember that climate change deniers and climate change advocates use the same data sets. So it's not really about facts. It's about something else. And that something else is the allegiances that people have when they search for information, which obviously influences the argument that they wish to make with that information. So that's what I'm trying to look at here. And so since more and more people use social media, and according to some data, it's more and more young people as their main source of news and views and evidence, and since most of that data, most of that news media is not regulated by journalistic standards, it's a key question to ask. How do young people, how do we, all of us, discern truth from a lie, a valid piece of news from propaganda? And this is just from the Reuters Institute of Study of Journalism, which found that there's a huge generational divide between people who get their main source of news and views and evidence from television journalism, and they also get it from online social media. It's mostly young people there, and it's trending as well. So it's a very important question to ask, and there's a preoccupation with facts, and I think that's important, but I think we need to look at trust and the factors there that allow a person to, make a person trust something or not. Another interesting piece of research is the Digital Attitudes Report. There's a lot of, again, when looking at ignorance, how personal information is collected. According to the Digital Attitudes Report, 83% of people are unaware about how information is collected, where news comes from. 62% were said to be unaware about how their social networks can influence what they see, and 24% were unaware of how online services make money. So there is a lot of ignorance about the mechanisms behind our digital literacy and our digital information seeking. So that's what I'm trying to really try to understand a bit better. So this is important because how these platforms obviously make money is related to how they present information to us. And these technology companies and social networking platforms are, in Deborah Bratt's terms, the new sponsors of literacy. So the epistemologies of ignorance becomes a very useful framing when looking at this problem. And epistemology, it's a very bit of a sort of contradictory term, though, isn't it? Epistemologies of ignorance. If epistemology is to know, it's about knowledge and how we know the world, and what are epistemologies of ignorance? Well, if epistemology focuses on knowledge, then the study of ignorance asks after its shadow, the absence of knowledge. Some have talked about anti-epistemology. Robert Proctor writes about agnotology when writing about how the tobacco industry in the 60s and 70s created an atmosphere through the suppression of certain kinds of research about the dangers of tobacco. So he called that agnotology. But epistemologies of ignorance generally is about how ignorance develops in society, how it is culturally sustained by dominant forces for the practices of domination and control and advantage, how it is sponsored and regulated, how it emerges as a social practice. It's not just something, how ignorance becomes ritualized through our everyday digital literacy. So we've kind of adopted it like that, how it is actively constructed and sustained, and etc. And so we've looked at it through the lens of digital literacy because we feel that it will, rather than looking at ignorance as a benign gap, looking at how it is fostered and developed through our everyday and mundane use of technology. Epistemic ignorance also has value because you can't know everything about everything. You have to be strategic and you have to make decisions about what you choose to know and what you choose to find out about and who you choose to trust. And so we all make decisions about about being epistemically functional. We'll trust certain people, and it's just the way, it's just the decisions that we have to make in everyday life. We tend to trust epistemic authorities, people with reputation and expertise, people who are known to be epistemically functional. We often judge what to believe, on whom to believe, and to make these judgments, we have certain criteria about plausibility, relevance, credibility, authority, etc. And so examining some of those is what we've tried to do. People in online environments, this is even more sort of black boxed and hidden away. Online rankings, the way search results are ordered, even influence this sort of thing. And so, do you remember that a white supremacist who shot down a group of black churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina, not long ago? An investigation revealed that up until the event, his search history included black on white crime, and the Google results subsequently led him to a lot of websites that showed anti-black propaganda, anti-black racist content, rather than a more sort of reasoned account of what that term actually means, how crime is really intra-racial phenomenon, and he was led down a certain path of inquiry, which was algorithmically determined rather than based on what is actually the most reasonable presentation of the facts. The Pew Internet and American Life project also reported that 73% of search engine users say that most or all of the information they find through search engines is quote, accurate and trustworthy, and 66% of users regarded search engines as a fair and unbiased source of information. So we felt that in the research that this needed to be looked at. So we looked at it amongst a number of things as part of the project. We also looked at higher education because students are novices within particular knowledge-based communities or academic disciplines. So they understandably rely on the direction and the guidance of epistemic authorities, i.e. lecturers, but also the institution and its digital technologies and the guidance of other people and actors. So there are asymmetries of power in the student-teacher and student-institution relationship, and examining how that's played out through their searches for information, we felt was a useful way into the problem. But although you can look at this in any sort of context, even non-educational as well. And academics are always telling their students not to use Wikipedia, and even though they're learning, sort of YouTube videos tend to give you a pretty good account of things sometimes. So there are, contentions there about seeking knowledge and using what to use and how to use it. And so we thought that was a useful way in. So the research project SRHE funded looked at students writing their assignments, something I've worked on in the past and I further developed for this project. It looks at we multiple ethnographic interviews. One of them was a walk-around interview where we walk around the campus with the student to see how their use of technology is mediated by their environment. Do they use institutional technologies? Do they use which spaces do they use? The actual title of the project, it was How Connected Are Students to Campus Technologies? So I was looking at that as a way in, and then we recorded a particular assignment, so videographic recording of the assignment, followed by post-assignment interview with the student about how they'd written their assignments, so going through it, all of that with them. And also there was some quantitative data looking at all the apps that they've used and how much time they spent on the internet, or using Word, or using whatever it was. There's an app called Rescue Time that gives you some pretty interesting but not that detailed quantitative analytics. So we looked at that as well. So to whom do they accord epistemic trust? How and why? There's 4 cases I'll discuss briefly as part of this paper with you, and the first one is Kim. So we looked at a student of cinematic arts, economics, medicine, and politics and philosophy. So Kim is a first-year student of cinematic arts. She gets a number of different kinds of assignments for her course. She never goes beyond, very rarely goes beyond the resources uploaded by her lecturer outside of the VLE. She sticks very faithfully to that. You can look at the lecturer's preparation of that reading material as curation, if you like, where the lecturer had put certain boundaries around the task in order to guide the student through it. This is important for Kim. She argues that it helps standardise and in some ways ritualise her writing practices for her assignment. She says, if I am the one who found it myself online, I would be sceptical about it. Kim lacks epistemic trust and confidence in her own skills and knowledge, so accords, quite naturally and understandably, epistemic credibility to her lecturer. But in the rare instance where Kim does have to go online to find something, outside of the framework of her lecturer's carefully curated resources, she attaches value to results if a keyword appears multiple times in search results. She attaches epistemic value to search results that appear multiple times. So multiplicity is one of her criteria for accepting a piece of information online. There was a kind of, so that's really sort of not very critical, as you can imagine, and there's a lot of dependence there, epistemic dependence. There was an interesting case with a pre-assignment task that I recorded of Kim's. Before her assignment, she did an online group activity where she brainstormed ideas with her group. Her group are, you could say, her epistemic community. Now, in this particular instance, Kim behaved very differently. She was very engaging and very critical with her group, and she managed to bring together the ideas of her group from the online activity and develop some really good ideas for her assignment. So her online information seeking strategies were very basic and quite uncritical. But in the group activity, within the limits of her epistemic community, she very intelligently curated lots of ideas and concepts for her assignment. When left free to roam around the internet, it was very simple. It's either everything my lecturer says or everything that everybody else says. But when left within the confines of her epistemic community, she exercised a great deal of discernment when checking things are valid or not within the parameters of that community. Another student was Rahat, who is a student of economics. With Rahat, not vastly dissimilar to Kim, in that his approach is very heavily reliant on the emails with the readings given to his by his lecturer. He says, quote, "It's all in the email. I don't have to do anything. It's the best guidance because the lecturer has read through it. I don't know about you, but I have to confess, I haven't read everything on the reading list that I give out. I read probably most of the stuff, but not everything. And I certainly haven't checked it. I myself, as a lecturer, have to trust certain people, certain journals, certain kinds of writings. So I'm epistemically dependent on a community as well. So there's sort of like, people trusting other people who are trusting other people and so on. And so there's this kind of his assumption that this lecture's read everything, and I can say that I haven't read everything that I give that's on my reading list. I wish I could. So he says it's the best guidance. He also benefits from his lecturer's tweets. He thinks that they are on par with thought leaders in the field of economics. When asked if students should be wholly reliant on the information provided by their lecturers, he said no, that would be too much spoon feeding. But that wasn't really borne out in his own practice that we observed. If further reading is required, we observed Rahat typing in the title of his assignment and going to search results that match closely to the title of his assignment. Unlike the Kim, who would focus on the multiplicity of key concepts in the search term, Rahat would very crude technique of just writing the title in and finding search results that match the title of his assignment when he needed to find something outside of the framework of his lecturer's reading list. As with Kim, he favoured top research results and judged the credibility of these based on their popularity and hence assumed reputation. It's also emerged in his personal life. If it's trending, it's true kind of approach. It's credible because more people are saying it. And this is an ancient, almost folkloric kind of understanding of trust. It's in academia, the more people cite somebody, it becomes seminal and more important. Of course, it depends on the nature of the citation, but usually if a positive one. And then so, but online, of course, it's a different ballgame, isn't it? It doesn't work like that. The more people say something, doesn't make it true. So another student was Nusrat, who was a student of medicine. Now Nusrat is interesting because when he writes an essay, he steadfastly limits himself only to academic sources. So much so that if he was searching for a topic, he would type in the search engine the topic and PubMed or Science Direct or one of the other ones, Cell, next to the topic, channeling all his search results through academic journals and nothing else. He's quite confident about that. He said, I wouldn't be using Wikipedia, I'd be looking at papers from PubMed and things like that, etc. Most of his web searching is channeled through that sort of thing. He understands that there's gaps in the PowerPoints, and he's happy to fill in the missing pieces. I don't know if you can see this, you probably can't because I can't, and I'm standing right next to it. But he had an assignment to do which we recorded, and the assignment was on the portrayal of mental illness in films. And so he typed in movies and mental illness PubMed, movies and mental illness Science Direct, movies and mental illness Cell, because he wanted to look at what's been researched before. He only trusted things that have been researched before, and he only chose those things, those films, as worthy of a topic to examine in his assignment. Remember, he didn't read them closely, so we recorded. He merely wanted to know what other people have researched and trusted that rather than completely sort of from fresh treatment of that film, because it wasn't a really. He only had to reflect on the portrayal of mental illness in that film. It wasn't really any sort of. He didn't have to look at any research articles. So the question here is about trusting what's been analysed before in previous research, and so that's he channeled all of it there. He also said that it's all about finding that initial paper. Once you find that initial paper, you can find everything else from there. He also said that if you go onto a website and it looks poorly produced or informally written, or only one author has written it, that would make me turn away from it. So he has disciplinary biases or constraints when trusting things online, and these are really sort of overstretching his what is valued in his discipline to anything that's out there. Even the presentation of the material has to be, how many people have written it. He attaches that to one of his factors of trust there. Right. So another student is Phil, and Phil is a student of politics and philosophy. So naturally, you'd expect him to keep up to date with news and views as part of his course, and he did that. He set up a Twitter account when he started the course, and then he got inundated with too much news and views, and he couldn't keep up with it or manage it. So he decided to stop using Twitter, but then he needed to keep some sort of input, if you like, of the news world, because to support his course. So he then needs to subscribe to Guardian Online, the news that's relevant to his course. In that way, he felt he could manage the multiple sources of news that he receives by relying on Guardian Online for, as he thinks, journalistic integrity, quality, and more importantly, views that are consistent with his own views, and thereby sort of blocking out anything that's not in the Guardian as a source of information. That's a strategic form of ignorance, and that's sometimes necessary. We all have to do things like that. But is that the right thing for Phil to do at this stage in his learning? You know, as an undergraduate student of politics and philosophy, shouldn't he be looking at other kinds of news from other sources in order to develop a more balanced approach to knowledge generation in his life? To be epistemically functional, we, like Phil, have to do these sorts of things, but it's good to sort of reflect on them a little bit. But he is not interested in consuming information beyond outside of his political framework. So yeah, that's Phil. In order to sort of manage his life, which is perfectly understandable. So, well, I mean, what do these practices of student digital literacy imply for our understanding of ignorance, as discussed in the paper early on? So, for all of these students, we see some similarities, but we also see some differences and some insights into the epistemologies of trust and ignorance. And there's more cases to discuss in the research, and there's more to look at, but I wanted to gloss over it quickly for you here. They differed substantially in how they search for information, how they manage it, and how they discern it for curricular work. Kim and Rahat, if you remember, typically followed the guidance specified by their lecturers, and both were careful to produce work that only draws from the resources provided by their lecturers. And when they did need to go beyond it, they relied on basic criteria of multiplicity as a criterion of authority. Multiple citations is a thing in academia. It's something that we do in daily life as well. But whether it works out like that online is another thing. Nusrat has a much more focused, casts a much smaller net in his searches for information, channeling all his information through journals. He even looks at journal ranking. He even looks at number of authors. He even looks at the quality of the presentation to make judgments about relevance and credibility when he searches for information. And Phil, of course, focused all his information or news information for his course through Guardian Online. In each of these cases, the digital literacy practices are ritualized, and all of our digital literacy practices are ritualized because we all have a finite amount of time and cognitive resources. We all accord epistemic trust in different ways to different actors online. So examining what that ritualization looks like, both in our own lives and in the lives of our students, is important in finding out how we all accord epistemic trust in different ways to different actors in our lives. And so I guess the literate activity of students in digital environments is supported and shaped by these technologies, but they're also economic forces or sponsors of literacy, as Deborah Brandt would describe, who through their digital platforms and technologies offer us opportunities, but also have the potential to constrain how we learn, what we can learn, and thus possibly even to suppress certain forms of knowledge. How students and how people in general make sense of these opportunities and how we make sense of the constraints and work through them or not is a massive educational challenge. And I wanted to sort of talk about that. It's a little bit more obscure than talking about facts and fact-checking and getting information right. It's more focusing more on the individual person and what their allegiances are, what their ritualized practices are. It's a little bit more abstract to talk about, but I think it's an important development of that conversation that I wanted to sort of instigate here. The project has only just ended, and I like to let data mature, if you know what I mean, and look at it again later and write more on it. And there is the paper that we wrote, Alison and I, springboarded into a special issue because lots of other people were interested in it. So we then, this is the deadline for this has passed now, but you might want to look out for it in the future. It's a post-digital science and education, and Alison and I are editing a special issue on the topics that have come out and from the subsequent discussion about the papers that we wrote and the special issue that we wrote in has now led into another special issue. So if you have something to write on that, please do let me know. The journal has a section called a commentary section, which is where you can write, and it's not really peer reviewed, but it's just like a views. If you've got something to write there, you could sneak that into the special issue outside of the peer-reviewed articles. It's an interesting new development for that journal. I guess it's trying to encroach into the grey literature a little bit, the blogs and things like that become quite popular. So yeah, that's that. And yeah, so I hope that was useful.
Thank you, Ibrar, for that wonderful presentation. We're going to take 5 minutes to have a Sussex buzz now, and I will give our guests online. We have 7 people from all around the world, from Iran, Paris, Senegal, Belfast, Brighton. That'll give everybody who's joined us online time to formulate questions. And meanwhile, we'll just chat to our neighbour and talk about what's come up for us, what you heard, any big messages, anything you want to ask Ibrar. It'll give time just to get our thoughts together before we get into the discussion. So buzz away, please feel free, and do help yourself to some coffee. Abdullah, tell us who you are.
I'm Abdullah, I'm a PhD student in the Business and Management School here at Sussex, and I think it's a really interesting study that's been done. And the thing that my partner and I were discussing about is the ethical issue behind the gathering of the data, especially in the first participants who's Kim. Obviously, this was done through, let's say, a website or a blog. So about of course, you've kept it anonymous, but were they, did they realize that they were taking part of, let's say, a study or a project that's taking place, or was just Kim the only person who knew that they were monitored?
Yeah, good question.
Do you want to take one question at a time
All
or
right.
gather them up?
Good
See,
point.
Abdullah's just finished our MSc Ethics course, so he's hot off the press. Great, good application of knowledge, lovely. Thank you. Who's next? Who's like? Let's take up a few questions, get that energy going. So, who's next? Question, comment, observation, thought?
Comment.
Yeah. And you are?
I'm Dan. I work in technology and enhanced learning. You've
Just
got
want to
something
pen.
on here.
Oh, a pen.
Sorry.
Yeah, low
No
tech
problem.
here. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it's more a comment, I think. But we've talked about how the habits of search, for example, have become ritualised based on our, the truth we accord to various things. For example, we're likely to use one app over another because it's better designed, or I prefer the look of it, or it's a nicer colour, whatever. What I'm quite interested in is how people who have maybe physical access issues or cognitive access issues or sensory impairment or whatever, they're sort of channeled down a route of what they can only access because it's accessible. Therefore, they might not have much choice in what they place value on and place truth in. So it'd be interesting to see how that compares. And yeah, I just think there's something in there because it's less about ritualising what they do, though I suppose that's to the same end, but actually it's through a different route.
Great. Should we take one more and then go back to Ibrar? Another comment, question, observation. Simon.
So Simon from the Department of Education here, and apologies for being late, so you may have made this point already, but to what extent did the research in any way unpick with the students any support or guidance they've been given about how to access information? So whether they had any study skills built into their curriculum or something that they could access outside of their formal curriculum.
Brilliant. So I've got 3 questions. This is a memory test for you, Ibrar. Like those quiz games, and all the objects go by.
I've written the questions down, but I've forgotten the names.
We'll work on that together. So the first one, Abdullah, ethics.
Yes, all the students were aware of it. And the video log is a very interesting process because it's very invasive, but it's very unobtrusive because it's not like a big camera interface, it's It's like you're just doing your work and then you're conscious of it for the first 5 minutes and then you forget that it's there. But all forms of research, I mean, having an observer in the room is going to be very invasive. I'm not obtrusive. So yeah, we and there's also another aspect, the data collection in terms of the analytics and the quantitative data on the apps that they were using, and how often and what time of the day, and that sort of thing. So that didn't collect too much detail. It just collected what they were using, when they were using it. It didn't collect specifics of who they were interacting with. So if they were on Facebook, it would just say Facebook tends to be used after midnight or something. It wouldn't say who they're communicating with on Facebook or anything like that. And the screen recording, of course, there was video logging after the screen recording, so we logged it, so it became textual. And then we just removed the names and any identifying features and things like that.
Okay, so accessibility.
Yeah, very important point. Not just accessibility, but affordability as a part with technology, and also what your friends and networks are using. So the second interview, the post-assignment interview, that was also a techno-biographic interview. And that kind of interview comes from feminist studies, where you talk about a person's history of use with technology, how they've developed in their use with particular technologies over the course of their life. And so we got an idea of their networks and habits of use over time, and phases of change in their life from that kind of interview. So the post-assignment interview also looked at the assignment, but it also looked at their past sort of life and the issues around that. So there's accessibility, which definitely I think is an issue worth exploring further, but also affordability and trends within certain friendship groups that influence the apps we use, and in fact technologies that people use as well. I use WeChat a lot more now because I've got more Chinese friends. So that's another, and the development in my technobiography. So, yeah. What was the assignment?
Study skills.
There was no explicit mention of it by the students. They are almost entirely, that we have seen, relying on their own instincts for seeking information. I mean, you get people who go through follow the library sort of instructions quite literally, like Nusrat did, where everything went through a journal in a repository. And then you had others less reliant on the lecturers, more reliant. Sorry, Nusrat was less reliant on lecturers. Then you had others who were more reliant on the lecturers, like Nusrat and Rahat and Kim. But these were all entirely self-constructed notions. There was no mention that I can find of formal support and guidance in how to discern information and how to seek it out. And I have a sneaky feeling that if there were any sort of training, if you like, I wonder how sort of useful it would be. I don't mean to discredit it,
No.
but I have this feeling that you know how you tell people something and then they go back and do their own thing at the end. I think it'd be a bit of that.
Yeah. No, I just reflect on some of the teaching that I used to do. So I was a history teacher, and I was a history teacher at the, kind of like at the dawn of the internet, if you like, where my students were beginning to use the internet. And so we had to change some of the teaching we were doing to get them thinking about what they were accessing, which for us was really important. And so for those students who then went on to higher education, they had been opened up to the possibilities of different ideas that were being shared on the internet. And I've done that with the teachers that I work with, but it's just a tiny little part of the curriculum that we're working with.
Yeah, we found that even just doing the research made the students reflect on how they go about doing things. They'd never actually reflected on it. They never thought, oh, hang on a minute, yes, I do that. Why do I do that? Because they were so ritualized with these practices that, and really unpacking that and detangling some of the issues you've raised, and definitely there's a story to be told there. There's something to be examined in more depth. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, let's have our next round. We've got Emily. Anybody else? Kelly? Anybody? No, I've got one as well. Emily.
Right. Thank you. It's from me actually, not from anybody here. It's a follow-up to Simon's question, really, about what you do with this kind of information when you're working with students. Because I ran a first year module with students around how to think critically about information. And so one of the things we do is we start to think about what questions might you ask of a source, that kind of activity. And I just wonder what would the questions be if we're thinking about this epistemology statements? What do we get people to think about?
Good. Kelly?
Yeah, I was at a wonky conference on this today on the secret life of students, it was called, and there was a lot of talk about Generation Z and the research that's being done now on Generation Z and their use of technology and social media and stuff. And, like, it sounds really obvious to say it, but like there's just this generation that uses technology in ways that actually older generations really don't understand. And they're using like 5 different devices a day, and they're flitting back and forth between their social media and background noise, Netflix or whatever, not just constant. And we've given them all these devices and said, here you go, kind of thing. So it's, it's not their fault that this is the world they live in. But so I know that sounds kind of obvious, but hearing you talk just makes me start thinking, how big is the gulf now between the sort of older generation understanding of technology and the younger generation, and how they're using it? Because unless you dig inside of it and research it and watch them do it, I think like a lot of us don't actually really understand what it's like. One of the points they made today was like for a lot of young people today, they have friends around the world who they've never physically met. They would have to get on a plane to meet them, but they are their friends. And like that kind of stuff, I think a lot of people just haven't quite come to grips with.
Okay. My nephew has digitised my house and absolutely nothing works now. Nothing. Okay. A question I had rehearsed with Ibrar in the buzz was how this could interact with theories of epistemic inclusion and epistemic justice. And I'm thinking about the work, for example, of Sarah Ahmed about authority. And I was struck by your first example, your first participant, and what she trusted and who she trusted. And I just wonder if authority sticks to certain bodies and not to others, and if there are issues of social difference that we need to take into account. So are some people more trusted than others? And I was remembering Emily's PhD thesis when she was asking people about who's a critical thinker, and it was so gendered, wasn't it? All their responses were so gendered. When her informants were asked, what's a critical thinker, nearly all identified a male, didn't they? And when you were talking about trust, who is trusted? And there's been a huge campaign, hasn't there, about who are the experts in our society, in the media. And invariably, they're older white men who are brought on to talk about everything, from climate change to traffic problems or whatever. So there's a huge issue about social difference and epistemic authority. And I just wondered if you played around with any of this theoretically. So 3 nice, big, easy questions for you. Okay. Critical thinking, generational divide, and social difference.
Well, I know this question on what to do with this critical thinking. Yeah, I mean, what to do with this? Well, that emerged to some extent in doing the research because we found that students became more aware of their ritualized practices through the conversation that we had with them. So I guess that's a way, getting people to reflect and to think about how knowledge is ordered in their online searches. And there are certain kinds of reflective experiments that you can do, I once heard of during the last US election, that somebody who was voting for Hillary Clinton, they swapped Facebook profiles with somebody who was voting for Donald Trump. And they both got completely different spins on everything on the news story that was out there. And so those kinds of things are helpful. Also, getting people to reflect on. There's a book by Sophia Noble on algorithms, I don't know if you've seen it. And some sort of awareness raising around that. The Google algorithm, Google search engine, is a very good one. She typed in Google black girls are, something like that. She's a black woman herself. And what she received in response to that search autocomplete. That's what spurred her to want to write that book, examining Google search engine very thoroughly and very authoritatively. So I think there's some sort of awareness raising that can be done there. There's also maybe a return to the impressionistic judgment of the human subject, the human sort of authority, but then that will lead to your question later, which I'll get to.
Hold that one back
Yeah.
then. Okay. Generational divide.
Yeah.
Is it a myth? Stereotype? Are we being stereotyped as older, incompetent, silver surfers, all that stuff?
I read somewhere.
All that little ego-boosting stuff that we do.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, getting people to reflect on, I mean, even older people, I read an article recently that some research that said that older people are more likely to believe fake news in a way, and so there's a lot to reflect on. I don't really know, Kelly. I don't know if there is we assume that there's a generation divide. We often sort of repeat that discourse, and with technological change and development and obsoletism when new apps, new devices come out, of course there's new mechanisms at play, and so yeah, there will be differences, not just within generations as well, because not everybody updates everything. So
there's also the question about scholarship, isn't there? Well, how this is impacting on scholarship. So if everything is about surfing and superficiality and moving very rapidly through different options, does that wire up our brains to think and to study in a particular way that's very superficial? And that there's the whole slow scholarship movement, isn't there, based on the slow food movement, that the slow professor's become a bestseller, hasn't it? Chance would be a fine thing. Yeah, but there is this view, isn't it, that from some of the neuroscientists that what you've just described is wiring people's brains differently. So our attention spans change, that we engage with information differently.
yeah, absolutely.
We go for what's the different types of knowledge, the just in time rather than the just in case kind of knowledge. So is any of this coming out in your research?
Speed is coming out everywhere.
Speed and superficiality.
Acceleration.
Yeah.
And when I was at school, my teacher said to me, if you don't understand something, think about it for a while. And if you still don't understand it, think about it again. And if you still don't understand it, think about it again. And if you still don't understand it, then ask me. But that was a really good, bit of advice there, because that's why I apply. And there's a lot of things I don't understand, and I'm still working through them. And so the slowness has gone, the acceleration has been valorized. The quicker you do things, the better you are, the cleverer you are, and the quicker you can retrieve things, information. Google used to boast about that. It used to say you've got this result in 0.0.8 second or something. Speed is valorized and acceleration, and maybe that's leading to superficiality and lack of discernment. Post-truth is also an emotional thing. It's an emotional reaction. It's not always about facts. Sometimes facts are available, and so we always try and tell the people who are believing the wrong thing or whatever that here are the facts, but sometimes that's not the thing that's.
I had a great paper in Australia that Foucault is to blame for the post-truth society. We were told not to trust anything or even to bother searching for the truth. Everything is situated and relative. So he's the problem. We can trace it all back to him. We lost our regard for truth.
Trump reads Foucault,
I'm sure he does. Yeah,
Very
yeah,
influenced.
absolutely. Okay, so speed, acceleration, deletion. You can get rid of things, get rid of people, get rid of ideas really quickly.
But Trump lies, and everybody knows it. And the thing is, trust has always been related to truth, but now truth-trust dialectic has been broken apart a little bit. So I think that's incredibly dangerous. Maybe promoting truth, but then the Foucault argument comes in.
Well, when we were young scholars, we were told not to use the word truth, weren't we?
Yeah.
It just lost all credibility. It was positivism. Okay, social difference. We're giving you a really hard time. aren't we? How does all this relate to social
Well, of course, I mean, Alison's the one to answer that question.
Okay, great.
But
she's
she's not here, no.
Why is she the one to answer the question?
Because she's an expert in epistemic measures.
Okay, right. Not because she's a woman.
No.
No, okay.
But absolutely, yeah. You know, how people trust what they trust and whom they trust is very important, and examining that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to tell that story. You raise the issue about the men and what the tendency there as authorities, and yes, and that we need to sort of expose that a bit more, but also trusting the algorithmically mediated forms of knowledge that we get. I mean, people used to, you know, when a dating site says somebody's an 80% match, a lot of people trust that rather than their mother, who might say, you know, watch out for that one, she's a bunch of.
Well, it assumes people are telling the truth. And there's been research, hasn't there, on online dating, and I think the biggest subject of untruth is age. People lie about their age, they lie about their profession, they lie about everything. So the algorithm can only work with the material that it's been fed, and if there's a flaw in that, then there's going to be a flaw.
This is something that's going to come up in a special issue.
Right.
Because it's called Lies, Bullshit, and Fake News Online. And BS is a term that describes something that isn't really explicitly a lie, but it's more to do with the sort of intention. The intention to lie isn't always there with BS. So when Burger King, or is it the other one that says "have it your way," that's not really right, because you're choosing from pre-configured options.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're not having it your way. So is it a lie? Well, it's BS.
You could say all that. Abdullah, you could say that about all research, couldn't you? We've been talking about this for the last few weeks. Okay, we have Sarah. Welcome, Sarah from Iran. Delighted you could join us. Sarah is a PhD researcher, and I met her when I was working in Sweden, in Gothenburg. And you're in Iran at the moment, Sarah, and you've asked a lovely question. So, Emily, would you like to announce it?
Sarah would like to know more if there were differences among the students that you spoke to from different disciplines and also different genders in the way that they made sense of information.
See how we got on together when we were in school.
There were certainly disciplinary differences, and I touched on some of those, including, for example, the very scientifically influenced web searching of the medicine, of the student of medicine. Of course, there's issues of, I mean, Rahat is a boy, is a guy, and then Kim's a girl, but they both have very similar information-seeking patterns of behaviour and mechanisms of trust. But both are not white, and the lecturers are. So I don't know if that's an issue. It's certainly worth examining further through further data sets. But yes, not enough to make an argument about yet, but the project is just ending. So I'm waiting for the data to mature.
Great.
But thank you for the question, and the points will definitely feedback for further examination. Thank you, Sonia.
Great. Any more questions, comments, observations?
I just want to pick up a thread.
Please do.
It's based, I think, on what Emma is asking, which, if I can remember that far back, is based on where Simon mentioned a question to me earlier. But given that technology is getting better at writing BS, writing rubbish, fake news, and it's the opportunity. I think you were talking to actually reframe how we support people with that. It's less about how to discern fake news, but actually understand how the tools you use narrow your field of view, and that breadth is sometimes as important, and understanding that I use that tool, I get this view, and just wondering if the opportunity is there, because not because we want it, but because it has to change, because actually discerning fake news is going to become ever harder.
Because there's so much of it.
And it's going to become less easy to discern, probably.
I mean, I don't know what that will result in, but it could result in more tribalism and people trusting people who they know closely, and people who, somebody mentioned Trump earlier. The thing is that his followers don't take him literally, but they take him seriously, whereas his opponents take him literally but not seriously. That creates a huge problem, because in the world of fake news, people will not take people literally, but they may, on tribal grounds, take people seriously. And that's not a healthy prospect for me, at least. I don't think that's.
Well, that's probably knowing that it's not true. But,
Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, please.
I was gonna mention it, but I came across it in the article. It was the issue of Facebook, where all the information was retrieved for Trump's also campaign, and the people were furious about it. Yet it wasn't completely stopped, and this was a way of misconduct of gathering the information that was available online for a purpose that the people weren't aware of, so it was for personal use. And yet, as I mentioned, it was not totally prohibited or totally banned. Would there be in the future a way to control this data? Would there be certain ways that similar actions will not be repeated in the future?
What's that in reference to? Sorry, what's the discovery of?
Yeah, the usage of Facebook's. So information was retrieved by the owner of Facebook, and this created a problem. But it was used for, of course, for Obama's campaign to actually run the elections. So this type of information was available. It wasn't available for everyone. Yet it was misconducted, and it was also mentioned in your, of course, edited version of this Google. So how would that in the future have, its implications, or how would it be restricted?
So you're talking about the news items and stuff?
Yes.
Any particular one? It's in the paper. I'm just trying.
It's in the paper. It's on page 306, and it's written, given recent revelation about Facebook, we should know now that our data can be.
Oh, that's the Cambridge Analytica thing. Yeah, that's the Cambridge Analytica story. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was all over the news that this type of data was there. And
Oh yes. Well, people still use it. I mean, I think Facebook, they membership reduced after that, but then they may have stabilised there. Maybe people will change how they use it because of that. I know people who've changed. I know people who stopped using Facebook after that story and started using it again, but changed how they were using it, so they became a more discerned user after that. So I think it'll change like that. People are becoming more sceptical, but when you're forever sceptical, you then have to engage in strategic ignorance, and you start referring to, according trust to people who you take seriously, perhaps if you don't take them literally. So it doesn't always, we don't know where it will lead, but it could be more tribalism. I'm only trying to find out what the problem is.
Question that comes up for me a lot is, what's the difference between fake news and propaganda? I mean, we were brought up on George Orwell and the USSR, etc., and this was always being discussed and theorised, wasn't it? You say one thing, you mean something else. All news is politically motivated. So what's the difference? Why have we reclassified it? Why have we shifted the vocabulary? Does it not fulfil the same purpose? To manipulate, influence?
Yeah, I mean, propaganda's been around since the beginning. Spin and so what's your question?
What's the difference between propaganda and fake news? Fake news, I mean, it's a shifting vocabulary, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it somehow suggests that it's new, that this is a new phenomenon. But propaganda's been around for as long as I can remember, been hugely theorised and included in so many works of art, so much literature. And I just remember, as a very young woman reading all Orwell and being absolutely blown away by his theorisation of it. How you can say one thing and mean something completely different, that everything keeps shifting. Look at the Animal Farm, you know, how the messages changed every week kind of stuff, and everybody had to rehearse them. So it's been hugely politically theorised, hasn't it, as a tool, and linked to, you know, despotic regimes, etc. And we've always liked to pretend in Britain that we have proper news, the rest of the world has propaganda. We have the BBC, and that's been highly problematic as well, hasn't it, with the recent attacks on the BBC on bias, for example. So
I guess it's intention as well. So
okay.
Also, fake news can be used as a form of propaganda.
Yeah.
So propaganda is more panoramic in its vision.
So fake news is intentional. It's not just clumsy and lazy and people not doing their scholarship. It's intention to mislead.
Absolutely, yeah. Traditionally, a lie was something where there was intent, and you can have benign lie. I mean, St. Augustine, Christian tradition talks about the midwives at the time of Moses who lied to the Pharaoh about when he ordered every firstborn. Yeah. So there was benign lie.
Yeah.
The intention to deceive for a good reason. But then there's the, telling somebody that their dinner was really nice when it wasn't, not to offend, and there's those kind of lies. So this, but then the BS argument comes in when there isn't clear intention to deceive, but the person who lies or BS's has a broader vision. Maybe they're marketing themselves.
Right.
Like Trump lies and BS's.
Okay. But does it tell us something about the way that knowledge is shifting? Yeah. Emily?
Mine was only a comment really. I guess I'm interested in this idea of fake news as absence, but also it has a value as well in some ways, or some forms of strategic ignorance. There's ways in which people want to read things that are pleasing to them, that want to read things that reinforce things about themselves that feel important. And also for some groups, I think they're protected from forms of violence against themselves. And I'm just interested in the idea that kind of emotional connection to having a partial truth. That's what we need. That's what some people feel that they need. And particularly, I think with vulnerable groups, they feel that they need some forms of closed spaces. That's the right phrase. Yeah. So just the emotional side of it, I think, is quite interesting too.
Yeah, emotional, but and also allegiances, theological, religious, and otherwise. And I'd like to sort of repeat or develop this research in other communities around the world, where people have different kinds of allegiances based on their traditions and whatever they may be, and different kinds of political climates and different forms of mechanisms of trust in their daily lives. And we're not as religious as we used to be in this country, but other communities around the world are, and religious authority is very, very important, because truth and trust are very strongly connected in some communities.
You know, one of the top, most trusted professions.
Learning technologist.
Sorry?
Learning technologist.
Academics are right up there at the top. That our knowledge is more trustworthy than journalists.
I mentioned the Christian
if
tradition.
only they knew. Sorry.
I mentioned the Christian tradition earlier.
Yes.
In the Islamic tradition, there's sidq and amana. You first speak the truth, and then you're trustworthy. And every prophet, according to the Islamic tradition, was sadiq and then ameen. He spoke the truth and then became trustworthy, and then was held up in society. So truth came first, trustworthiness came after that. And different places have a different sort of different philosophical tradition, have a different take on it.
I was just thinking that there's something about fake news. No expertise in that, but in my understanding, one of the things of it, and one of the intentions is not necessarily to persuade you with something that's fake, but to undermine your trust in what you read more generally. And it's a kind of there's a slightly different kind of control going in there by making you
It
uncertain.
destabilises you. Brilliant, brilliant point. Simon.
And again, this is my ignorance, because I might have missed this at the beginning. What was the sample of the students that you worked with, and the disciplinary range? Because you spoke about cinematics, studies, medicine, and political science. I might have missed that one.
Yeah, well, there were 10 students altogether, and because of the depth of the data collection, the number of interviews and the long, deep recording. A small-scale project could only handle 10. The students were selected to get a cross-section of disciplines across the faculties and schools in those universities. So it just depends on how the universities organise their sort of STEM, arts and humanities, and business and marketing courses. But we got a cross-section across every faculty in each university, which numbered 10 altogether, 5 each.
Because I found it interesting about a political scientist who may have had some training in engaging in knowledge sources and evaluating those as part of their previous studies or of those studies, whereas for others that might not have been built in. But even in, I guess, in cinematic arts, you would hopefully be introduced to the idea of an interpretation of some, and that it could be seen in different ways, and whether those disciplines led you down a path of being more critical of what you engaged with.
Different kinds of criticality.
Yeah, and asking questions about why is this presented in this way. So I just wondered if that came out, whether the disciplines, I guess if you've gone for this cross section, then I guess you won't know until you've repeated, I guess, some of the same subjects again. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
definitely, and that's another way, another angle to approach this is to look at how the students, as novices in disciplinary communities, develop in their awareness and criticality and discernment as they develop in their discipline and become a little bit more independent. That's another angle to this.
Kelly.
This is sort of related to some of these comments, but one of the things that I'm reflecting on, given what you said about the participants in your research and how they trusted the curation of the academics so much. We have, like many other universities, a decolonize campaign, and so we have students who are really passionate about it and wanting to challenge academics about the curation of their resources. And it's really interesting, the data that you've got that kind of suggests that there are a lot of students who actually wouldn't challenge in that way because they trust, they rely on it. And I thought it was really fascinating what you were saying about who they then trust outside of the curated readings of the academics, where they'd say if it was written by one person, then it's probably not trustworthy. You can't decolonize the curriculum if you have that, so it's really fascinating.
Well, that was disciplinary, I believe. I think that was more closely related to in science. Looking at attaching good value to multiple author.
But even in science, you could have the known feminist physicist or whatever. That is not trustworthy because she wrote something on her own.
And yet that's what you're encouraged to do for the audit culture. Yes.
I just wonder whether there's an element as well about a kind of literacy of the rules of assessment in a way, and trusting the lecturer, because ultimately that's the person that's going to be assessing you.
Yes.
And seeing it as a kind of almost like a closed loop that you're participating in as an actor, rather than necessarily thinking that that's the sum of knowledge for that discipline. It's the sum of knowledge that you need to pass and get your grade and move on to the next step.
Well, we have the impact agenda here in the UK, and we've had lots of training sessions how to do impact, huge cost. And they told us at one of them, said, how to get your research out there? Well, you have to tweet it. Got to tweet it. Because the parliamentary researchers, this is so depressing, it's untrue, the parliamentary researchers, when they're given the topic they've got to research, they start with Twitter sphere. So, I mean, there is this horrible reductionism, isn't there, of very complex knowledge to one-line tweets. And then that kind of links into the celebrity culture. Although academics are very trusted, often when celebrities endorse something, it has a more potency than people who've spent 30, 40 years researching the topic. So there are weird shifts, aren't there? And it goes back to your point, Kelly, about the kind of the impermanence of it. And one of my friends has got a 2-year-old, and he goes up to paintings in people's house, tries to swipe them, gets really, really impatient because they don't move. And there's this kind of opposition, isn't there, between stasis and fluidity and movement, and we're told that fluidity, mobility is good, stasis is stuckness, you know, so knowledge has to keep moving, everything has to keep moving all the time, that anything that's too static is dead and stale. So we're getting very potent cultural messages about what is valued and what isn't. And a lot of the old scholarly ways are losing their credibility.
Yeah, you can't tweet a monograph.
You can't quit.
History.
Tweet Shakespeare.
Did you used to teach history?
I did.
Well, historians, I mean, most of their research outputs will be monographs.
Somebody tweeted a novel. I can't remember what it was.
A one-line.
Physical.
Somebody they tweeted their whole novel. Somebody
Was it?
tweeted that.
Yeah, there is a kind of growing mixture of people telling stories using text messages.
Yes.
In and out to tell a story.
Yes.
That can hook you in because you can't find out what's going on.
Yes, there's
It
that.
fades the
It's a
information.
genre.
There's that Irish novel that's had all the Sally Rooney, isn't it? Conversations with Friends. It's all text messages, and the irony is there are no conversations.
No.
It's all text.
Announcements.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else before we let Ibra have a rest?
Just
Maybe
going to
work
work
on
on
it.
one more thing, if you don't mind. Sorry, I realised I didn't introduce myself earlier, so I'm Tony, I'm a technologist manager here. And picking up on some of the things earlier, I just wondered whether you picked up when you're talking about the students as kind of novices within their discipline, and they're coming to sort of learn the practices, I guess, of that discipline, whether you picked up whether they were consciously, it's around transferability of the digital literacies, I guess, but whether they were consciously sort of compartmentalising, or for this particular purpose of producing an assessment, none of these practices apply, or were practices from their social life just fluidly slipping in and then adopting those in the absence of knowing what else to do?
Yeah.
Was there anything around that conscious process, or just unconsciously happening?
I think because these are all undergraduates and early on in their degrees, there's compartmentalising and learning the ropes, you know, and learning how to do things, and so. But in terms of flows and movements of the nature you've described, in terms of criteria of judgment, yeah, you know, like multiplicity, as I mentioned, is something that's passed on from everyday life, trending and that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, that's something else to look into as well, I suppose. So the flows and movements of practices and the blurring of boundaries. Yeah.
One of the discussions we had in our module was about the public-private merger in the digital world. People often think they're speaking to friends, but they're speaking to the whole world, and who owns the material, and also the impermanence that it gets deleted. So it's really hard to use knowledge on the web for any scholarly purposes because there's no audit trail. It just disappears, vaporises. And we talked about this a lot, didn't we? That what are the new ethics when you're using the digital world for your research?
Most digital platforms, the default mode is openness and public, and then you have to
But
go
who
and
owns it?
fine-tune.
Who owns the material?
Of course, yeah.
Who has the copyright? Is it the person who tweets? Is it the platform? There are lots of ethical challenges that really aren't being fully theorised.
And awareness raising and ignorance.
Absolutely.
You know,
Okay, anything else before we call it a day? So well, all that remains is to thank our participants from all around the globe. Thank you. And thank all of you for coming on a beautiful spring evening. And thank Ibrar very, very much for a wonderful session, coming all the way from Belfast.